God is trying to emphasize that life matters. Life matters right here. Don't separate yourself from life and say, oh, my hope is all in the afterlife. Like, no, that's what the Egyptians did, and it's wrong. It's not correct.
Welcome to Acton Line, a podcast from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. What are contemporary attitudes toward the market in the United States and the larger Jewish world? What is the historical contribution of the Jewish community to economic dynamism? And how does this relate to anti-Jewish attitudes and prejudice? In this episode, Rabbi Mitchell Rocklin sits down with the Acton Institute's Dan Huger for a wide-ranging conversation on Judaism and markets. Rabbi Rocklin serves as the president of the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty and is also a resident research fellow at the Tikvah Fund. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/podcast. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate with the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Rabbi Mitch Rocklin. Rabbi Rocklin serves as the president for the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty and is also a resident research fellow at the Tikvah Fund. He received his PhD in history from the City University of New York Graduate Center, held a postdoctoral fellowships at Princeton University and Yeshiva University, and taught at both the City University of New York and Princeton. He is also a chaplain in the Army National Guard with the rank of major. Rabbi Rocklin is a member of the Rabbinical Council of America's Executive Committee and Military Chaplaincy Committee. Prior to his current work, he served as a congregational rabbi in Connecticut. His writings have appeared in a number of publications, including the Los Angeles Times, National Review Online, The Daily Wire, Forward, Public Discourse, and Mosaic. Rabbi Rocklin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, today we're going to be talking about Judaism and markets, but I want to begin by talking about religion in general. Much of the time when we talk about markets, we think markets are the province of economists or people in business, investors, these sorts of things. What does a religious perspective bring to enrich our appreciation and understanding of markets?
I think that one of the biggest problems that we have is an understanding of religion as divorced from considerations involving anything material. And this is an old problem that goes back to the era of Gnosticism and Neoplatonists and just about everyone who wanted to separate what we commonly today often call somewhat anachronistically, the spiritual and the physical. And you hear a lot of religious talk about that today among Jews, Christians, and Muslims for that matter. Oh, separate the spiritual from the physical or somehow make the physical spiritual, as opposed to seeing human life as embodied, seeing human existence as something good and something creative and something that's in a partnership with God. Because really we only get to the dynamic notion of free markets as an intrinsically good thing and as an incredibly productive and beneficial activity in and of itself through really I think a Judeo-Christian tradition that sees human beings as living in a covenant with God, in a relationship with God, which demands really that we understand human beings as responsible, not only for ourselves, but even for the manifestation of God's divinity here in this created world. Because say the Greeks on their own, who developed the disciplines of the West, they develop all of the disciplines of the West, including economics. they have the realization that man should search for himself, that man should discover who he is. He should take responsibility for his own cultures. Diogenes, the cynic, used to go around with a light, looking for man in the light of day, and that light was a light of reason. But the Greeks can only get so far on their own with their own pagan religion. They need covenantal religion, which comes from Judaism and develops, of course, in both Judaism and Christianity, and also in Islam. They need to have the view that God is searching for man. God is actually looking for us. So that provides an imperative for us to search for ourselves. We are beings who are being searched for. In other words, human existence is intrinsically important. And our wealth and our ability to live well is not just something that we could do or should do or perhaps ought to do. It's actually vitally necessary. God wants us to do it. So that's a tremendous source of inspiration, which brings the Greco-Roman tradition together with the Judeo-Christian tradition, brings reason together with revelation, and it provides an impetus for the kind of creativity that would drive markets forward and that get people to think about economic growth as an intrinsically good thing and a valuable thing and something that we have a duty to promote for the well-being of all of God's people.
So religion brings us back to the human person at the center of economics, and it brings us to those. It escapes me now who this is. I've heard Peter Betke reference this before. He talks about that the center of this is humanity's alluring hopes and haunting fears, and that Lord Acton used to say there are two principles that rule the world: religion and economics. What man strive for in this world, in the case of economics, and the next, in the case of religion. Now, Judaism has a very unique contribution. The first is the eldest of the Abrahamic faiths, and so much of what gets worked out in different ways in theology and Christianity and in Islam has its basis in this Jewish tradition. Where does the Jewish tradition on reflection on the markets begin?
Sure. So I think that in the realm of economics, Judaism is particularly important, not only for Jews to understand economics, but it's actually vitally important for Christians and Muslims as well, because what Judaism never really lost sight of, and of course there's always theological debates, but by and large, Judaism never really lost sight of the imminent presence of God right here in every moment of existence, and therefore the importance of human activity in producing creative things, in being creative with what is often dismissed as the material. Jews never really had a problem with that. Jews were at the vanguard of the development of markets in medieval Europe, for instance, both in Northern Europe, where Ashkenazic Jews lived, and also in Southern Europe, where Sephardic Jews lived. And this occurred both under Islam and under Christianity. And Jews didn't really have a problem with capital and with the development of economics for a simple reason. They didn't really see a divide between God all the way out in heaven and otherworldly considerations versus what are often dismissed as worldly considerations. Jews wanted to appreciate God's presence right here in every single moment, which Christians came to understand as well. Augustine, a Christian, of course, was the first to philosophically explicate the notion that God and eternity are not found somewhere far, far away, far, far off in the heavens, but as Augustine put it, God can be found in the eternal sublimity of every moment. So every moment of human existence is lived close to God. This is a covenantal outlook. Judaism creates this covenantal outlook, and it comes from Revelation, of course, in the Bible, and it's explicated in many, many Jewish poetic sources. But Christian philosophical formulations of this poetic revealed notion are going to be very, very important for giving people an understanding that the activities that we do in what seems to just appear to be this sort of created world, they're not just important for some afterlife. They're important right now. They're just intrinsically good and important. And so Judaism, I think, practically shows us that you don't need to be uncomfortable living life in an embodied way in the real world, and it also provides a philosophical, I should say, a theological foundation to allow for a Christian philosophical understanding that actually this is where the action is. The action is right here. This is what God wants us to focus on. He wants us to be creative. He wants us to be fruitful, to multiply, to conquer the earth and subdue it, as Genesis describes, and to be fruitful in the full sense of the word. Fruitful in the Hebrew is peru, like to be fruitful. It doesn't just mean like multiply like fruits. It means to be creative, to create wonderful things.
That's an excellent summation of this tradition. When we think about, and here we talk explicitly about creation, providence. These are the Christian sort of categories. Not that they don't exist, but the providence language might be more unique. In God creating the world, sustaining the world, making provision for human welfare, providing instruction to humans into how to live fruitful lives. Where does the covenants themselves, when we think of typically like the Noahic covenant, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant on Mount Sinai, how do those inform our thinking about markets or the Jewish tradition of reflection on markets?
Yeah, in a way that I think is very important, especially in light of secular modern critiques of Christianity in this realm, because I think that Judaism, a return to Christianity's Jewish roots, can provide us with an antidote to the problem of materialistic secularism and material determinism in particular. The religious notion of covenant, which is, by the way, it is at the very beginning of Judaism and Christianity. And this has been demonstrated by many scholars, and you can see it in the Bible itself pretty clearly with a straightforward reading. The notion of covenant is the central understanding that allows for Judaism and Christianity, which follows. It's always pointing human beings to their responsibility for themselves and their responsibility for God's project. In other words, God is not just saying, okay, I have this program and this is how it's going to be realized, and I could have a bunch of robots do it, but I created free people and hopefully they'll do what the robots could have done. No. It's a dynamic relationship in which God is in a back and forth and a give and take with human beings. God wrestles with human beings throughout the Bible.
I'm thinking of Abraham's conversation about Sodom.
Yes.
And the negotiation there.
Yeah, Abraham negotiates with God about Sodom, and God wants him to negotiate. God says before the negotiation, God says, am I going to withhold from Abraham what I'm doing? No, I want Abraham to pursue righteousness and justice, and so I'm going to reveal what I'm doing to Abraham. I'm going to let him know, and then I'm going to take his feedback, right? And it's not just, oh, thanks for your feedback, have a nice day. No, it's Abraham says, well, come on. Like, can't we save the cities if there's 50 people? What about 40, 30, 20, 10, right? And that tradition continues. So Jacob wrestles with God in the book of Genesis. And in fact, his name is changed to Israel. And the Hebrew word for Israel means to struggle with God, to wrestle with God. Moses struggles and wrestles with God and saves the Israelites. God wants to destroy the people, and Moses says, no, I won't allow you to do that. If you do that, you have to erase me too, right? And this would be seen as sacrilegious by pagans. And in fact, if you read someone like Tacitus, Roman historian, he didn't know very much about the Jews, but what he knew about them, he says that he can't figure out what they worship. He says they either worship one of two things. He says they either worship no gods or they worship themselves. Right? They only have faith in themselves. But it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Like, what does a covenant look like from a pagan point of view? It looks terribly sacrilegious. It looks like what you're saying is, well, there's only one God, and he cares only about people, right? So it looked selfish, right? The gods didn't have their own affairs. And it also meant that human beings had responsibility for God's divinity being manifest, which to a pagan looked incredibly incredibly outrageous. It looked sacrilegious. How can you say people are responsible for God's divinity being manifest? It must be that the Jews believe in themselves. They don't really believe in God. No, we do believe in God, but we believe that God is in a partnership with us. And that's at the root of Judaism and Christianity. The reason this is so important for economics is because our creative capacity is the central purpose of creation itself. In other words, we have to get beyond an older religious understanding, which can sometimes lead people into complacency and passivity. And this is where I think we need to be honest and recognize that modernity had a legitimate critique of medieval thought. That's not to say that modernity didn't caricature the Middle Ages incorrectly, but at its core, the moderns were saying something very, very simple. Medievals became too complacent. They became too reliant on God's sovereignty alone, and we need to recover human agency. We need to recover an emphasis on human agency. And that's why it's hard to distinguish between, say, many Christian humanists and many secular moderns, because they're essentially making the same argument. And the church was struggling with this when it had to deal with Christian humanism. Do we excommunicate people like Meister Eckhart and Pico della Mirandola, or do we say that they're Christians? And so the seculars say, you know what, we're just secular. We don't need the church, right? Now that, of course, is a tremendous mistake, because without God, we of course lose our humanity, and history has shown us that pretty clearly. But we need our humanity. We can't just say, "Oh, God will provide. God will provide." You know, like there's the old joke that there's a guy who's drowning in the ocean, and a helicopter comes to save him, and he waves it off, says, "I'm waiting for God." And a boat comes and waves it off, says, "I'm waiting for God." And eventually he drowns and goes up to heaven and complains to God, "Why didn't God save him?" And God says, "You idiot! I sent you. You know, the helicopter and the boat." Now, there's always this temptation whenever we're religious, and it's a temptation that I think modernity was critiquing, but I think we don't have to be secular in order to understand that critique is valid and that critique can be responded to. And I think that the Jewish tradition provides a very strong model of understanding the human agency as absolutely essential to God's manifestation in this world.
This is really fascinating. There's an essay by Paul Hayne, the late economist, who was himself seminary trained before he left the seminary and pursued economics, where he taught, and the essay is, "Are Economists Basically Immoral?" And there's a point at which he says, as long as churches need pews or kneelers or hymn books or all of the stuff of worship itself needs to come from somewhere, and someone needs to do it, and that needs to be coordinated in some way. And thus, the economy is essential in everyone's business, including religious people. Now, you've outlined sort of a theological understanding of the basis for this. How has the Jewish community historically worked this out in its own history? They're often leaders in innovation. They often have been merchants, traders, have facilitated exchange to the benefit not only of their own communities, but all of their neighbors in the wider world, providing services. Could you unpack a little bit of that history for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important for Jews and Christians, but especially Christians because of the nature of the Christian Bible, to remember that the Old Testament comes before the New Testament. And if you read the Old Testament, there's very, very little emphasis, if any, on an afterlife. And that's by design. The Old Testament could have focused on an afterlife very easily. For instance, Egyptian society was obsessed with the afterlife. So the Old Testament intentionally minimizes the afterlife. There are a few references to afterlife here and there, but they're very fleeting. And they don't go into any sort of detail. You do not get the impression from the Old Testament that the reason you live life is for an afterlife. And the emphasis, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's pretty clear. God is trying to emphasize that you have to live life matters. Life matters right here. Don't separate yourself from life and say, "Oh, my hope is all in the afterlife." Like, no, that's what the Egyptians did, and it's wrong. It's not correct. So whenever the Bible promises rewards in the Old Testament, it promises things like grain, water, children, long life. They're all what we call worldly rewards. But the Bible says these are important things because, number one, as you mentioned, you can't live a religious life without these things. And number two, they're just good. They're just good to have. That if you're not abusing them and you're using them well, then they are intrinsic goods. Now, Jews throughout their history have indeed focused on productive creativity in realms like you mentioned, commerce, trade, the provision of medical services, the provision of charitable services to uplift the poor, in the same way that Christians have. But I think that Jews have done it in a way that is less apologetic than Christians. I think that in the Christian tradition, you have more. You'll have the response often, well, is this really what we should be focused on, right? Or maybe we should live a more ascetic life, right? We should live. We don't need all these material things. You don't really find it in Judaism. It's fascinating. If you open up a Jewish encyclopedia of, say, rabbinic sources from the classical era and the early medieval era, and you look up an entry like wealth and poverty, for example, it'll reference all of the sources in rabbinic literature that talks about wealth and the products of wealth, you can read through them. I've read through all of them myself, and you'll find a tiny handful that are ascetic and negative towards wealth, and the vast majority. It's not even close. It's almost every single reference is positive, and that's very much the Jewish spirit. It's one that is promoting. It's promoting the goodness of this world in commerce, in the development of wealth, in investment, and in the improvement of people's lives. And that's very much been the Jewish tradition. What you have in modernity is a very difficult problem, and you see it among the Jewish community in a way that sort of predicts what would happen with Christian communities, and that is secularism offers this sort of perceived way out of religion. And people really create a dichotomy between religion and secular life where they feel like they've got to choose between them. And so many of the most productive Jewish minds just become secular, right, with Spinoza and afterwards. And this is a very human problem. This is not a Jewish problem per se. It's just that in many respects, Jews, just like they were at the vanguard of religion, are also at the vanguard of the critique of an older form of religion. And people couldn't really figure things out. So you end up getting people like, say, David Ricardo, a prominent economist who of course converts to Christianity, but was a rather secular person, not a deeply religious person, but who channels his religious passion into the secular. And there's a Jewish theologian of the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, who commented on this sort of development with respect to secular people who care about things and who want to accomplish things. He said there are some people who think they're atheists, but they're really not atheists. And there are other people who think they're religious, but they're really atheists. And his point was that if we want to understand true religion and really get back to the essence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have to understand that the Judeo-Christian tradition is a religion of covenantal religion. It requires us to be productive and to produce. If we don't do that, we're almost like atheists, right? Not quite atheists, perhaps, but pagans. God will take care of everything, right? God will take care of everything. Although in this secular era, what we often mean is we don't know, like, right? It's almost nothingness. And the same thing is true with the secularists. They often think they're godless, but actually they're motivated by a godly drive to be responsible for something truly and intrinsically important, which means they're actually worshiping God. They just don't even realize it. So I think that our challenge is to recover the realization that religion and human creativity and productivity are synergistic. They go together in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
As you're remarking on this, I'm reminded of the novel by the late Chaim Potok, The Chosen, which has this is one of the tensions in that novel between one of the boys in the story and his father. And his father is an esteemed rabbi. He is to follow him in this tradition, but he has interests in the humanities, in psychology, that he fears, and his father fears a little, might be secular and might not be part of living a Jewish life. And I'd commend that novel to all listeners because it's a really moving sort of meditation on some of these issues. Are you familiar with?
Yeah, it's very much so. It's a very well-known novel. Yeah.
It's an amazing work. Now, part of this difference between Christianity and Judaism and the way that some Christian perspectives that are more otherworldly oriented has historically led to some very sad animosity to the Jewish people and anti-Semitism. And a lot of that anti-Semitism is also bound up in anti-market attitudes. Could you unpack some of that sort of tragic legacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that they are intrinsically connected. And I think that anti-Semitism is an existential problem of the human condition. I think it's often or usually not understood that way. It's often understood as a problem stemming from ignorance or from prejudice or bigotry. And therefore, I think it's often wrongly simply lumped in with other forms of bigotry. No, I think there's something much more existential about it, which is why it uniquely pops up in areas that don't have any Jews. So there's often anti-Semitism in parts of the world where there are no Jews living whatsoever. And there's a reason for that. The Jew stands for the covenantal notion in a way that no one else quite can. Christianity, I think, is clearly the closest to Judaism in understanding, and in many respects, there are so many shared understandings of between Christianity and Judaism that I actually think it's important to. We often lose sight of the fact that Christianity is, of course, an outgrowth of Judaism, and was, of course, a Jewish sect for at its inception. So, I think that's a whole other problem, is that people often falsely think that Christianity is radically different than Judaism, because in so many ways it's not radically different than Judaism. That's not to say that there's no radical difference, but I think that there's many more similarities than we appreciate. But that said, the Jew has always stood for the humanistic part of the covenant that emphasizes man's responsibility for the manifestation of God's divinity, which means all human beings are essentially living on the abyss. In other words, we live in a dynamic world. We live in a world where the natural state of things is not rest, but motion, right? There's potential in every single moment. That is very scary. It scared people for a long, long time, right? When Galileo realizes that the natural state of things is motion and not rest, as Aristotle would put it, that was frightening. That was very, very scary, and understandably so. It's scary in the realm of economics also, right? If dynamism and entrepreneurship can produce new horizons and new realizations, right? If we live in a situation in which the moonshots and the loonshots of the world are gonna change things and will live in ways that we can't even possibly predict right now, that's a frightening prospect, because we really don't know what the future will bring. What the book of Isaiah describes, we don't know what the new heavens and the new earth will bring. Jews have always stood for a vision of that bright future, which involves uncertainty and involves mystery, in the sense that we don't know where history is going, but we know we're living in history. We're absolutely confident that we're living in history and not nature. Now, Hegel would put it that way, but it's very much deriving from a Jewish understanding. Now, Christians share that understanding to a very great extent, particularly Christian humanism. But Christianity, because of doctrinal considerations, never quite goes as far as Judaism. Christianity is always going to fall back on the Trinity and the God-man of Jesus as the way in which the covenantal relationship is realized. The Jews are making a claim that's more radical, and that is that it's every single man, every single woman, every single human being is responsible in the same way that Jesus was responsible for the connection between God and man. Now, that's a very radical claim, and it's going to lead to all sorts of hatred of Jews for obvious reasons, but not all the reasons are obvious. For instance, the hatred of the free market is, I think you can see based on this backdrop, the hatred of the free market is the same. I wouldn't say it's the same thing, but it's intimately linked with the hatred of what the Jew stands for in covenant. Because why should I say that I think that things are unsettled and that human beings are responsible for development, right? That's a very scary thing to say. No, I want everything to be more or less the same and to develop in an orderly manner, right? But the spirit of the West is very different from the spirit of the East, right? We don't sink and dismantle our navies and not go out into the world, right? No, we have a spirit of exploration, a spirit of discovery. It's very unpopular because human beings we really have a problem with freedom and the dynamism of freedom because it's very, very frightening for obvious reasons. So Jews were at the center of economic development in the 19th century when modern scientific anti-Semitism developed. I say scientific in quotes. Obviously, it's not scientific, but the anti-Semites posited that it was scientific. But along with quote unquote scientific racism, which is not really scientific, but that was the claim. But anti-Semitism develops in tandem with opposition to free markets in places like Vienna, which was both the capital of anti-Semitism and also the capital of free markets in all of Eastern Europe, in terms of railroad development, banking, so on and so forth. And up to half the middle-class population of Vienna was Jewish. Odessa, further east in what's today the Ukraine, before it was the Russian Empire, Odessa also had, I forget the exact figure, but I think it was something like a third of Odessa's middle class was Jewish, way out of proportion with the Jewish population, the Russian Empire. And Jews were part and parcel of the commercial development that was going on in Odessa, which was so vitally important to the Southern Russian Empire. And hatred of the free market and hatred of economic liberalism, lowercase l, old-fashioned economic liberty, was tied at the hip with anti-Semitism because people were attacked for being quote-unquote cosmopolitan, quote-unquote unrooted, right? Too free. There's too much freedom, right? Yeah. We can't have this. And Jews were seen as the target because fundamentally and existentially, that is what the Jew stands for, this dynamic. And by the way, I'll conclude my answer with this. It, of course, and now we see it, we say, of course. I don't think it was obvious at the time, but it, of course, led to anti-Christianity. Because if you hate Jews for what they stand for in all of these respects, then of course you're going to come to hate Christianity for what it stands for in all of these respects, because Christianity fundamentally stands for the same thing. It may see the Trinity as the way in which the covenant is expressed, but more or less you're talking about the same thing. And of course, anti-Semitism leads to totalitarian hatred not only of Judaism, but of Christianity and attempts to exterminate it.
One of the things I'm curious about is what you see in the modern world in the Jewish community's relationship to the market. Because we've seen also in the modern world Jewish figures that are critical of the market, even some Jewish leaders, hostile or at least ambivalent to the market. What do you think of that dialogue as it's unfolding within the Jewish community in today?
Yeah, I think there's a misnomer. I was once asked by a journalist from the New York Post to try to explain why Jews in America are are, as he put it, radically socialist. And I said, well, that's not really actually true. And there's statistical evidence to demonstrate this. And he says, well, what do you mean? There's people like Bernie Sanders. And I said, sure, well, those are the visible people, but that doesn't mean that that's where Jews are by and large in America. The reason you have people like Bernie Sanders and historically anarchists and communists and Emma Goldman and all these types of people is for a very simple reason, right? I mentioned it earlier. Jews who abandon their religion and are still really religious at heart, right? They're looking for an outlet, so they develop a secular theology, or they join a secular theology as a replacement religion, but that's not, by and large, where most American Jews are. A majority of American Jews, there's a lot of data to demonstrate this, are pretty clearly moderate, certainly on economics. Most Jews are actually moderate Democrats in the United States, clearly in the moderate wing of the Democratic Party, not the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. People don't realize this because there are so many vocal Jews who are leaders in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but that's not where the voters are. And we know this, actually. There's also a big contingent of Jews and a growing contingent of Jews who are more right of center on economics in particular, but also on social issues to a great extent, particularly groups like Orthodox Jews, Russian Jews, and a growing contingent of just ordinary Jews in America who've turned away from liberalism as it's become more socialistic and have gravitated more to the right. So there's a growing percentage of Jews who are in favor of economic liberty in America. But it's also important to realize that America is an unusual situation. America is a place where people feel very comfortable, and most Jews in America are basically comfortable with the economic freedom that we have. So there's more political flexibility. But in places around the world where that economic freedom is in question, Jews tend to be much more to the right in politics. And in fact, the United States is rather an exception for Jewish communities, being more in the center left. In Canada, in Europe, and in Israel and Australia, Jews are on the political right of the spectrum. And that's where most Jews in the world live. Majority of Jews in the world no longer live in the United States. And a majority of Jews will soon live in Israel. Israel has been economically liberalizing, lowercase l, meaning becoming more of a free country for decades now. And in fact, if you look at the OECD, Israel is one of the most economically free countries in the entire OECD. It has one of the lowest tax burdens, and it's getting better in the realm of regulations. It has a lot of old legacy regulations that are still around, but those regulations are disappearing. Successive governments have been stripping them away. So Israel is already in a very good position, and Israel's heading in a better position. And I think that as the recent legacy of socialism as sort of an alternative to religion kind of dies away among Jews around the world, you're going to continue to see a growing Jewish appreciation for economic freedom, which is really just recovering the old Jewish legacy of economic freedom, which dominated Jewish communities for thousands of years. The socialist legacy is a blip in the bigger realm of history. It was a little experiment that began to be tried in the 19th century. And it's an experiment that I think is coming to an end.
I think it's a fascinating perspective that you bring and remind us that, the Jewish community is a global community and is increasingly a less American community. What have been the animating forces in sort of Israeli politics and in Jewish life in Israel that might have contributed to that recent trend of deregulation, liberalization, a freer economy in the Jewish state?
Yeah, it's actually fascinating because free market ideas in Israel are growing on both the right and left of the Israeli political spectrum. It's fascinating to see, and I think it really brings out Rabbi Abraham Kook's comment, that theologian of the early 20th century, that some people are atheists, and they don't realize it. They think they're religious, and some people, and vice versa. Some people who say they're atheists, they're really religious, and so on and so forth. In Israel, the whole country has been growing in its religiosity. Israel used to be called a secular country. It is no longer a secular country by any definition. Even self-identification. A majority of Israeli Jews consider themselves to be at least traditional, if not outright religious. And even that terminology is very misleading because it doesn't really adequately describe the religiosity of Jews. The reason is Judaism is such a commandment-heavy religion that somebody who, say, isn't meticulous about keeping all 613 commandments would call themselves not religious, right? But by any American standard, they'd be profoundly religious. Solid supermajorities of Israelis are religious by American standards. They believe in God. They participate in religious life cycle events. They pray. They go to synagogue. I'll give you an example. An Israeli who goes to synagogue once a week, but also goes to a soccer game on the Sabbath, would call himself not really religious.
Yeah.
Because he's not fully keeping the Sabbath. But by an American standard, what? That guy's totally, he goes to synagogue every single week and he, eats kosher and he keeps all these different laws and believes in God and prays. Of course he's religious, right? By an American standard. So if you use an American standard to describe Israelis' religiosity, I would gather, based on the polling data, it's something like 75-80% of Israel is now religious. Israel's Jewish population is now religious. You have another 20% or so that's Muslim and Christian and Baha'i and other groups. But I would say that among religious Israelis, there's a growing sense that socialism is discredited and that it's not something that ought to be followed. And on the left in Israel, on the left of the political spectrum, as people have become more traditionalist, not necessarily religious, but more appreciative of Jewish tradition, there's a growing realization, we don't really need this socialist ideology. And actually, economic productivity is a good thing and economic freedom is a good thing. And so I have to give them credit, because, I myself am more right-wing in the political spectrum, but the Israeli left has actually been instrumental in getting away from socialism and coming to the realization that, no, you know what, this is not the way to go. And publications like Haaretz, which is one of the most left-wing papers in Israel, has a pretty right-wing economics section now. Where they promote market literacy and free market education. So I think it's a maturing community that's getting away from what in historical terms, I'm a historian, I like to think in broader historical terms, but from a historical point of view, the socialist experiment is not very long. It lasted from, roughly a century and a half. And it's coming to a close. I shouldn't say it's coming to a close. It's more like Churchill. We're not at the end, but we're sort of at the end of the beginning.
Yeah.
But the pathway is clear. And I think that it will only continue as the benefits of economic liberalization and freedom have become manifestly clear in Israel, which has now become the center of Jewish life internationally.
Rabbi Rocklin, thank you so much for being with us. This has been an enlightening conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.